Today's topic is Hastened Fatalis, or to be more specific, Hastened Fatalis 2.0. With Season 4, this item will see an overhaul, and it not only affects the item, but also various gods who currently have an Hastened Fatalis effect in their kit. So as I know, the only god who actually keeps his Hastened Fatalis effect is Erlang Shen, because all ranged gods that currently have some sort of Hastened Fatalis effect in their kit, which allows them to bypass the basic attack movement penalty, will no longer have this. I could start this off by discussing how much the change was needed or not needed for Chronos and Sol, for example, but in the end I feel like it's not really worth discussing when we just know that Osiris does not want this effect on many gods, or they don't want it on ranged gods specifically, and as such it has been removed. I think in the end, regardless of if you like the decision or not, it will make these gods easier to balance. They may have to get some compensation buffs, but that's not the main point of the video. I do think that removing Hastened Fatalis as an effect from gods generally increases the skill cap a little bit, because every god is now more reliant on hitting their basics and basically doesn't get a free pass in that regard. And based on that, the question is, should Hastened Fatalis now be implemented in multiple gods' builds? Is it worth being implemented? How are the stats? And so on and so on. To start with this, Hastened Fatalis stats got changed. 10% attack speed have been removed, so the item now has 20% attack speed, and it gets an additional 10 flat penetration over the previous stats. That is a change that I would say is generally in favor of Hastened Fatalis. 10 flat penetration early on is very nice for some extra damage from your basics as well as abilities, and it works for both physicals and magicals. So in that regard, Hastened Fatalis got somewhat of a buff. In certain late game builds, the 10% attack speed may have been better, but overall, 10 flat pen allow you to include Hastened Fatalis earlier in your build and more effective in most places as well. But are the stats actually good for the price? We need to compare Hastened Fatalis to a similar item, and the one that is most similar in this regard is probably Ikaival. So, keep in mind that Hastened Fatalis costs 2,140 gold, which is quite a decent sum. It gives you 20% attack speed, 10 flat penetration, and the passive. Now, Ikaival only costs 1,700 gold, so you're saving 440 gold. It has 30% attack speed, so 10% extra attack speed. Also has a 10 flat penetration, so all the same value, and it has power steal to up to 30 power. So by these numbers, especially when factoring in that Ikaival is also cheaper, it should be very obvious that Hastened Fatalis is still not the most DPS efficient item out there, and it will probably never be, simply because of the passive. So it's not really making sense to do many stat comparison here, especially because you can build both in a build anyways. What's more important is, how much do you personally value the passive, the Hastened Fatalis effect? If you value it highly, then you may be choosing Hastened Fatalis despite of getting better stats out of Ikaival. Because the stat difference only does so much when you're able to juke much better, and you're much better at chasing down targets and can get an advantage that way. Certain gods needed Hastened Fatalis before in most scenarios, despite of other items giving better stats. So for example, on Bakasura or on Freya, you can still run Hastened Fatalis just as before. You don't have to, there are other options, but especially on Freya, you're most likely still going to stick to Hastened Fatalis. And even on Bakasura, it's one of the cheapest choices that allow him to stick to targets. But what about gods that didn't previously build it, especially the mages? Poseidon will be excluded here because he's a bit of an outlier case where you can always build it late game if you want to, but he's not the god that depends on that because most of his damage comes from early burst. With Hastened Fatalis and Poseidon, just go for it if you like it. The gods we're looking at here are Chronos and Sol. Both previously had a very accessible Hastened Fatalis effect in their kit that is now removed, and both really did benefit greatly from those. Especially for Chronos, it was a very important effect. Now, I would say it is not necessarily wrong to build Hastened Fatalis on them now. At the same time, I would not say it is mandatory in all situations. Many people seem to think that Chronos needs a full damage build in order to be effective and cannot invest enough into attack speed for it to work, but keep in mind that Chronos was also able to implement Winged Blade into his build previously, so in many scenarios, Hastened Fatalis would just take the place of Winged Blade. You sacrifice a fair bit of survivability for that, but I kind of think that you should sacrifice something to get a Hastened Fatalis effect. The scenario is not that much different for Sol. Hastened Fatalis will greatly help her keep her passive up and chase targets down. At the same time, you could easily build her a more damage focus, more ability damage focus as well, and just try to reliably hit more harder hitting basic attacks. What is important for both of these gods is that the other attack speed items for mages actually lost attack speed. Demonic Grip gives 5% attack speed less, and Telkhines Ring gives 10% attack speed less. So attack speed is becoming a bit of a rarer stat. There are other items that provide you with attack speed, but in this context, let's look at what Telkhines Ring does now. Successfully hitting enemies or structures with basic attacks gives you a buff of 10 magical power. This buff stacks up to 5 times and lasts 5 seconds. And I think this is very important. This item specifically is very important in the context of Hastened Fatalis on mages. Simply because you want to hit as many basics as possible. Hastened Fatalis obviously makes it easier to hit basic attacks, and as such is helpful in that regard. Not only because of the passive, but also because it provides you with attack speed. This attack speed translates into power with Telkhines Ring, and it's a decent amount of power because in total, if you consider the base power on this item, you can get up to 130 power from Telkhines Ring, which I think is great synergy. You could go simply into Pen Boots, then maybe Hastened Fatalis, and then Telkhines Ring, and you would have a decent amount of power, pen, and attack speed to your name, which would allow you to hit very hard with those basic attacks relatively early into the game, despite of Telkhines obviously being one of the more expensive item choices. And that's something that I feel like many people are missing out on. The Telkhines change has a major impact on basic attack mages, and I feel like at this point it could easily become core on many of them, especially on Sol, who kind of works off hitting many basics in the first place. So while you're losing something in other places maybe, this will still allow you to have a build that gives you high amounts of power and high amounts of attack speed in a very, limited amount of items. 2 items, 3 items should be enough to give you a base of these stats. You're not going to have crazy power and you're not going to have crazy attack speed, but you should be all set for both. And as such, I think Hastened Fatalis very much has a place in that context. What about hunters though? Physical hunters who do not typically build Hastened Fatalis. Well, for them, as before, Ikaival is the better choice, or the magical equivalent that we have now. But the question is, do you want to trade someone with Hastened Fatalis with those items? If you think you're able to, and I think on higher levels that will mostly be the case, then I don't really think you need Hastened Fatalis. If you feel like you want to have a bit of an edge on the enemy in terms of boxing, and you feel like maybe you're not that good at playing hunters, but you have to play them, then Hastened Fatalis will greatly help you now, and it's not as bad of an early choice as it was before, simply because that flat pen gives it a lot more early game value than the pure attack speed that it had beforehand. For most other physical gods, like assassins or warriors, things should pretty much stay the same. There are certain ones, specifically Bakasura, Kali, and especially Vamana in the warrior section, that can make use of it, where I would generally recommend building it. Less on Vamana, but it can be built. Whereas with the rest, not too much changes. The gods that made use of it beforehand still do to the same extent, but no other gods seem to be suddenly forced into it because they would get major benefits out of it that weren't there before. Certain low mobility hunters can take it into consideration for early a little more, for example Skadi, but then again Skadi wants completely different stats. Other than that, she wants a lot of power, so it's kind of a bit awkward spot as well. And really, you can always build on many gods to stick to a target, but generally they have hard CC, they have slows, or you won't get too much out of the stats that Hastened Fatalis has in general for it to be worth it. 10 flat pen is great, but don't confuse 10 flat pen with a massive amount of power or ability damage that other items like Jotun's Wrath, for example, can give you. It just isn't the same. It's a good stat, but it's not crazy good. As such, I think Hastened Fatalis is in a better place than in the last season, and there is more of a reason to build it on especially magical hunters, as well as some other gods, simply because of the added flat pen. But the item overall isn't greatly changed. What's also important in this context, especially when talking about hunters as well, is that Sprint has the Hastened Fatalis Effect back. Sprint no longer provides you with slow immunity, which means you can only cleanse a slow when you use it, but everyone on your team will get the Hastened Fatalis Effect for the duration of Sprint if somebody gets the upgraded version. This doesn't necessarily have to be the Hunter, it can be though, but even if your support gets Sprint and upgrades it, then everyone on your team will have Hastened Fatalis and it will allow you to stick to targets until Sprint runs out, which is very, very strong. So that, in the end, may actually end up being more impactful than the change to Hastened Fatalis itself, simply because if you get someone on your team with that Sprint effect, you may not even want to have Hastened Fatalis because it basically ends up being a wasted item slot. With that, thank you guys for watching. I hope this clears up some of the questions that some of you had regarding Hastened Fatalis. I hope to see you for the next one tomorrow. Duke SLOTH, out.